Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Please.
No, I was just thinking if we would mute ourselves so the background wouldn't interfere with her speech talking to us. Could we do that?
That's good. And then if you want to, well, I'm going to stop sometimes and invite you all to say something, but also if you just want to ask me a question, just unmute yourself and make a noise. I can't see all of you when I'm sharing my screen. I can just see a few, but there aren't that many of us, so it's perfectly fine if you want to just say, ah, or make some noise. I don't know, decide on a noise. All right, so why I love the Gospel of Mark. I think I also, when I was doing my own study, I studied Paul because Paul's letters are the earliest thing in the New Testament. There's something about me that just likes the earliest. And it's likely that Matthew and Luke each had a copy of Mark. And so that was the baseline for them. So I'm really interested in Mark as kind of the baseline gospel. And it also, the other thing about it is very much shaped by the historical context of the Jewish war in the late first century. So if we think about the time between the crucifixion and resurrection, and then the time when Mark achieved the form we have it in, that's about 40 years, from somewhere around 30 to somewhere around 70. And I think that Mark's community had been located probably in and around Jerusalem. And at some point when things got really, really difficult, they moved further north, whether north into northern Galilee or southern Syria, which just comes abuts Galilee. So I think that they saw firsthand and had friends and family members who got caught up in the war, which was horrendous. The Roman troops camped basically where the Garden of Gethsemane is, and they could look across a ravine into the walled city of Jerusalem, and they could watch people as they tried to starve them to death. So they closed off the city. They tried to close off the water so that people could not get any water. And they sat there and watched them dying. And then they weren't satisfied to let it end that way. And they went in and they just slaughtered everybody in sight. And then they burnt the whole thing. They burnt it. It was so hot that these enormous stones of the temple actually exploded from the heat, and they were hot for a long time afterwards. So they had been through a terrible, traumatic event, these Christians who were at this point still among the Jewish community. And, it's clear in Mark 13 that they did have some awareness of the war itself. Like they had information about the war and how it went. So when we hear there, don't turn back to get a coat. If you're fleeing the city, don't so much as turn back to get a coat. That's from their knowledge. Even however much Jesus may have told them that terrible things were coming, by the time they write this, they have firsthand knowledge of events that Jesus talked about. So what amazes me about this community, so one of the things about New Testament study that's really poignant to me is like, these are the words, these are the way the stories are told about Jesus. They were held in the memory of people who for me are giants of the faith. That community of Mark who held the stories and kept telling them between 30 and 70. I think they're amazing, and they passed them on to the next generation, and they wrote them, and we are still finding life in them. And they no matter what they had seen, no matter how hard it got, they did not lose their faith. And that just is in every word of this gospel to me. So a lot of that is why I love Mark, is just kind of that background. So any questions about that? Okay, if you don't make a sound, I will keep going. So I want to talk about like 3 things that I just really, really love about the Gospel of Mark that are kind of unique to Mark. So the first is the author's ability to describe characters with realism and with compassion. So I've got a piece here from Mark 5, the story of the Gerasene man. So I'm going to read a bit of it, and then let's stop and let's talk for a little bit. And we'll try to talk, even though I need to keep the text up here. We'll just see if we can do that. So they, and the they is Jesus and the disciples in a boat, they came to the other side of the sea, so that's the Galilee, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he'd stepped out of the boat, he being Jesus, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And then here's a description of the man. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. The Gospel of Matthew is longer than Mark, and Matthew has the same story. But where they have the same story, Matthew never has as much detail as Mark does. So I'd love to hear you just say what parts of this description of the man really kind of strike your heart. So you could just unmute yourself and say it.
Chains he wrenched apart.
Yes, the chains he wrenched apart. So they keep putting these chains on him. I keep picturing like the cold and wet chains, and he's pulling them apart, like that desperation. What were you going to say, Jamie?
No one could have the strength to subdue him.
Yeah, that's one of those places that seems so full of compassion to me. It's a terrible situation, and why is he out there by himself? Why do they think they need to subdue him somehow? Or maybe he even wants to be subdued, but he can't be. Like there's just this spirit that's got him like this. So hard. Like Kathleen, you're unmuted. Were you going to say something?
Well, you know, the very beginning of this description of him among the tombs and breaking free, I mean, it's almost like a little bit of a metaphor of Christ, you know, being crucified and being put in the tomb. And then he rose from the shackles, from criticism, from everything. So it almost seems like a little bit of a metaphor there.
That is so interesting. And you're right on to something of Mark. In a lot of these stories in Galilee, we read our English text will say that someone stood up after a healing, but what it says in Greek is the person rose, and it is the same word that's used for Jesus being raised at the end of the gospel. So there are all these resurrections that Jesus is bringing to the people of Galilee. And so I think you're right on that there are these echoes of Christ in these people. And you know, this man doesn't have a name. He's one of these people in Mark who are nameless, but who end up being models of really strong faith. And that's interesting too, to think like they don't have a name, but they are in some ways little Christs, in the same way that Christians are little Christs. They are. So thank you for that.
I think it's also interesting to see that there's such a strong inner conflict that he took out his madness upon himself by bruising himself and
Yes.
expressing his, obviously there's a conflict going on.
Yes. And that that helps us kind of move into the next bit. So this story, the stories in Mark often work on multiple levels. So they work as exactly the story that you read about the Gerasene man. They also often work at a kind of metaphorical or symbolic level as stories about the wider situation of the Jewish people. So he's both who he is, but he also represents the condition of the Jewish people under Roman occupation. So the fact that he is bruising himself with stones, I think, is a really interesting diagnosis of what it's like when people are under a very oppressive regime, and they actually they so much don't know how to be free that they hurt themselves, like they internalize it. So this man, he has internalized this legion of demons, and we'll talk about the legion in a second. He's internalized the oppression. He's subjecting it to himself at the same time, which is just, we keep having like these levels. I feel as though first you hear someone's trying to live among the tombs and you think, oh my gosh, what's that like? But then you hear about the chain, and then shackles and chains, and then how he's pulling at them. And then people want to subdue him. And then he's howling and bruising himself. Like the story gets more and more, his suffering becomes more and more apparent in the story. Well, let's get the rest of the story so that we can see what's done with it. So when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" You got, like, that's such a moment of compassion for me. What's your name? Then the demons respond, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. So once we learn that the demon is named Legion, that's a tip-off to the connection with the Roman occupation. And we're about to encounter the swine. So the 10th Legion, the 10th Roman Legion, had jurisdiction over Jerusalem, and their insignia was the wild boar. So here's another place where the story kind of kicks up another notch. It's always working on these multiple levels. So I don't want you to ever think that we've lost track of the story of the man. That isn't a story with integrity, but the way it gets told, it also includes the story of the nation. So he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And there's a kind of dark humor here, as though the Roman occupiers are saying, "Oh, please don't send us out of the country." Now they're on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding. So, for Jewish readers, the fact that the Roman legion has a pig as their insignia, that's sort of funny. It sort of symbolizes just how awful they are. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them, let us go into the pigs." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea. And in Greek, that word rushed, it's like how armies rush, how they gather in a unit and they rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. So, I think if you were a child reading this, the child's question is, well, what's happened to the pigs? That's so sad. But this is an adult story. And these swine really, I think at this point, pretty thoroughly embody the Roman occupation. And so the destruction of the occupiers is something that is welcome to the populace that has been suffering, the way the demoniac has been suffering. So the swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. Again, like those details, right? Now he's clothed. He has his humanity back and he has his mind back. The very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. So we have both a human level story of people who are frightened by someone else's healing, but we also have a societal story of people who've come out from occupation, and that's really scary. And, I think about some of the ways in which, as a nation, we have tried to be bearers of freedom to other countries. And it has not always been easy for those other countries to live into that freedom, to know so how do we organize this? What do we do with this? And I think on that second level, that's sort of what's happening here is you get rid of Rome, but then now how do we manage? Those who'd seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. This is scary. This level of coming into one's own agency, that is scary. As he was getting into the boat, the man who'd been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends." What an interesting thing. At the end of this story, who are his friends? We haven't really seen any friends. We hope he has friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he's shown you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. And amazement is a really important word in Mark. You'll come across it all the time. And I think it really has to do with that moment when your mind opens to something new and you don't know what to do with it yet. But amazement is good in the Gospel of Mark. It doesn't mean, they don't understand it. It's beyond understanding, but their minds have opened in a whole new way so that they might understand something really new. Any final things about this story?
I liked one of the things that popped out is how many it kept talking about unclean.
Yes.
That it was an unclean spirit. And he was in among the tombs which were considered unclean to the Jewish people. And the demons went into pigs.
Yes. So there are all these things that are kind of unholy. And then in the midst of it is this beautiful healing, right? The healing can take place where you do not expect
to the
it.
Jewish people. And that just struck me as, I don't know why, but it just seemed like.
Oops, I'm missing a bit.
I was just struck by unclean spirit, the fact that they were in unclean, the tombs were considered unclean to Jewish people, and the swine were considered unclean, and all of them have a part in this story.
Absolutely, yes. And notice that holiness, the intense holiness of Jesus is not vulnerable to that uncleanness. And I think that's a really important thing that we sometimes don't get about Judaism, is the sense that holiness is powerful. And the reason it sometimes has to be protected is actually just that we are sometimes not prepared to come into that sphere of holiness. It can be dangerous for us if we're not prepared. And but Jesus himself, he can be there. He can be among all of that, in a place of death, in a place of uncleanness. And this power of God that's moving through him can bring life to a place like that. I think that's really important for Christians to grasp, is this power of holiness, and to lean into that and to trust that that's with us.
This is a small question. Decapolis said he proclaimed in it. What is that?
That's a set of 10 Gentile cities, kind of on the eastern side of the Galilee. Thanks, that's a good question. Okay, I want to keep moving because I'm hoping to get to the end. If we don't, we don't. We'll do what we do tonight. But I wanted to come into a little bit more of Mark 5. All the good stuff is not in Mark 5. There's good stuff elsewhere, but some of my favorite things are right here. So this is the story of Jairus's daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage. I really want to just look at the story of the woman with the hemorrhage, but we need the setup of Jairus' daughter to understand the thing that I just love about Jesus in this story. So one of the things that I love about Mark is Mark's portrait of Jesus. He's very human. Something else I almost use, but we just don't really have time, but is when Jesus loses it with the disciples, and he says, like, they get in the boat. There's been two feedings of 5,000. They get in the boat. They're saying, "Did you bring me bread? I didn't bring you bread. Who brought the bread? Where's the bread?" And Jesus just turns on them and he says, "Why are you still worried about bread? Okay, when I blessed the bread for the 5,000, how many baskets were left?" And he goes through the whole thing. He says, like, "Don't you understand this yet?" So he's very human, and a lot of that gets taken out. And Matthew and Luke don't, that bothers them a little bit. And I enjoy this very human Jesus that we see in Mark. And but he also, his just the depth of his faith and faithfulness also really come through, and his that powerful holiness that he mediates for others. So in this story, what I want to look at is how Jesus uses time. So Mark 5:21, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side. So he goes, in Mark, the geography is kind of like this. Jesus is going back and forth a lot. A great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came. So this is a really important episode because leaders have not really been so friendly to Jesus, whether they've come down from Jerusalem or they're more local. So this is more of a local leader of a synagogue. And this man recognizes who Jesus is. It's high level. I think, as we'll see, for the disciples, that's really important, and they want this to go well. So Jairus came. When he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly. "My little daughter's at the point of death." So that repeatedly, I think, is really important. She's at the point of death. She's at the point of death. Like, he's just so worried. He is deathly afraid. "Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he's just repeating that over and over. So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. So you can kind of feel like they've got to move fast. This little girl is going to die if they don't get there soon. And now he's kind of slowed down by these people pressing in on him. And now the story slows way down. Now there was a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. We find out later, this little girl is 12 years old. The woman has had this problem for the entire length of the life of the little girl, which sort of plays with our sense of timing. So she's been suffering for a long, long time. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. Again, like just finding those details to tell you her story so that you can feel it in your own heart and in your own gut. She was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. So she's, again, one of these unnamed characters who has so much faith. If I just touch him, I'll be made well. Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. She knows it. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now the disciples, his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say who touched me? Like, I think that I'm probably reading this in the story, but I feel like the disciples are really wanting to get on to the important thing and the important man. And let's go to the leader of the synagogue's house and let's do something amazing so that everybody can see what you can do. That Jesus doesn't operate like that. And he looked all around to see who had done it. He's not in a hurry. He has faith in God. The woman had faith in him. He has faith in God. He stops and looks to find the woman. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. The whole truth is 12 years. That's the whole truth. I picture Jesus totally stopping, sitting down on the curb or whatever there is in the first century and talking to this woman and finding out her whole story. And then after hearing the stories, I kind of feel like the healing happens in two parts. There's the touching, and the woman says, like, she knew that the bleeding had stopped when she touched him. But the second level, I think, is when he listens to her whole story. And then he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. That's very characteristic of Mark. For Jesus to tell her, her faith has made her well. He really doesn't say, I just did this amazing thing for you. He says, your faith made a channel for the power of God to work through me and work through you for your healing. If you keep tracking that through Mark, I think you'll see that pattern that God moves power through Jesus. But if a person does not make a channel of faith, it is very hard for that healing to come into their life. And so mostly we see the positive side of that. We don't see the negative side. We see the positive side. People presenting a channel that faith can work with and bring healing to them. And I think, the healing, it's on multiple levels. It is both, it's her body and her spirit. And again, I think that this is a story that has that second level. Josephus is a Jewish historian, a little bit later than Jesus, but in the first century, just a little bit younger, like a generation younger than Jesus. And Josephus's account of the Jewish war describes the blood in the streets, that people sloshed through it. Sorry to make it so vivid, but I think there's a level at which the hemorrhaging woman is hemorrhaging Israel or hemorrhaging Jerusalem. And it's a call for the people to have faith so that God can help heal them. And it's on these multiple levels, spiritual and physical healing of the nation. Questions about that? Thoughts, insights? The little girl does get healed. I put it on here. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's terrible to leave the story without seeing the end of that. Another really beautiful part of this story is, notice the woman with the hemorrhage doesn't have anyone who's with her. She's not connected with anyone, whereas the little girl is the beloved daughter of the leader of the synagogue. So that daughterliness is so important for her. And at the end of Jesus' encounter with the hemorrhaging woman, he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." And there's that really beautiful claiming of her as Jesus' daughter, God's daughter, the people's daughter, putting her back in relationship. Is this a story, this use of time by Jesus, is that something you have paid attention to before or wondered about with him? Mark tends to run at a pretty fast clip, and these points where it slows down are really important, I think. So here we just slow down and pay attention to this one woman. Okay, you are not talking as much about this one as you did about the last one, so I want to just check
Jane?
in on you. Yes.
I did have something when I was reading, as I've been reading Mark, I've kind of been looking at some other sources too. And one of the things that I read about was, we were just talking about a lot of the unclean that gets brought up. And then this woman that comes to Jesus just to touch his cloak. And I read about how her disease, the bleeding, is considered unclean, that she's unclean. And so it's interesting that she didn't reach out and actually touch Jesus. She touched his clothes so as not to actually make him unclean as well. And I just thought that was really interesting. And then he's in 34 there, he says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So it's almost like he acknowledges that, that actually she's kind of been healed. She no longer is unclean, and that he's never truly been made unclean either. I thought that was interesting.
Yes. So one of the directions in New Testament study in the last 20 years, but it's really picked up, I guess, in the last decade, I would say, is getting clearer about the Jewish law, like really studying more and more Jesus's own Judaism and Paul's Judaism, and the extent to which they remain like thoroughly Jewish all their lives. They never stop that. That's an ongoing reality. And Christians have sometimes tended to overstate the cleanliness rules as a way of sort of differentiating between Christianity and Judaism. And here, I think you were careful in how you talked about it. So I was really interested to hear how you did that. Because I think everything that you said was just like tracking with the story as a Jewish story. But one thing that some people don't understand about uncleanness is it basically just means that you cannot enter the temple and offer a sacrifice. It's not, you're not unclean for daily life, except, in marriage, there are rules about, women menstruating and at what point can someone sit on her bed, and there's all these kind of intimate rules. But as far as just operating in society, a woman could still go to the market, people could bump into her, nothing's going to happen there. Like there's nothing about that. But it is, you know, you do, I think, you're right on about her sense, you have a feeling in her story that she's made alone by this, and that she does just touch this hem of his garment, so as not to bring anything about her that might trouble him, not to overdo that, any relating to him. Um, and yeah, she seems so, she has this beautiful combination of unstoppable faith and humility. Like and I feel sorry for the level of humility that she has, because she is a person of such faith. So all of that is a really interesting part of the story, I think. And there's a woman named Jo Levine, you may have heard of her, I don't know. She's a Jewish New Testament scholar who's written on this, and she just wishes Christians would just focus on the fact that this woman is sick and needs to be healed, and that we wouldn't get so wound up in talk about uncleanness, which she thinks we don't understand very well.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
clarifying that, and for
Yeah,
educating me on that. I appreciate
but your way of telling it was also very careful. Like, you didn't run with it. You didn't go into this whole, there's a lot of people will say, oh, and Jesus talked to a woman and men were not allowed to talk to women. Yeah, they were, because they're in the markets together, you know, how much are those onions? You know, like, it's just all this regular old life going on. And you didn't hype the story at all. Okay, well, let's end with Mark's really provocative ending. And I think that I love the word provocative as it relates to Mark. And I mean it like really seriously, that Mark wants to provoke our faith. And so Mark makes these interesting kind of hooks that grab us and pull our own faith out. And I think even the stories that we've seen, that we've read so far together, they ask you about your faith. They make you kind of enter into the story imaginatively. And I'm going to stop the share for a minute because I want to share a picture. So I have to stop and then pull something else up. I want to share a couple of pictures with you. Okay, I need to, share again. So this is a picture of a tomb and I thought you might be interested in. Sorry, I've gotten blurry. It's because I move around in front of my camera and then it can't find me. But anyway, so have some of you been to Israel and on pilgrimage or something? And so often when we picture the tomb of Jesus, I've always used to picture like a sphere, like a round stone, but it's round like a wheel. So I'm going to use my cursor here. Here's the rolling stone. It's going behind something here, so you can't see. It's perfect. It's, you know, pretty nearly perfectly round. And here's the opening to the tomb. And then this first room where the light is strong is where the bodies were prepared. This happens to be up in the Galilee. This is not in Jerusalem. The first room was where bodies were prepared for burial. And then these little small niches back here were places where people would put the body for a year, seal it up and let the flesh decay off. And then they would put the bones into what's called an ossuary, which just means a bone box. And so I thought it might be helpful because we're going to look at the end of Mark and the story of the resurrection. So I thought it might be helpful for you to just see what that would look like. Because the women are worried about the stone. And I'm always thinking, yeah, I'm worried about the stone because I picture this as an enormous round boulder. Okay, I get the text again. All right. Okay, so here's Mark's ending. So this is, Mark has a bunch of endings. Are you reading Mark straight through? Have you gotten to the ending, or are you? No, okay. Don't want to spoil the story. I have to say, the times that I've studied Mark with people, like, we get so attached to Jesus that by the time we get to the end, we are missing, like, it's terrible. It's hard to get to the end. So, but I think what underlies this very provocative ending is faith in the face of suffering and loss. And so let's look at how. So remember, there's both the death and, and the resurrection to come of Jesus, but the community telling the stories of Jesus for 40 years, they have also experienced the tragedy of the Jewish war. So this is overlaid with that. And the call to have faith is a call with full recognition of the war. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" Again, such a human detail. So Mark wants you to really get there. So very early on the first day of the week, he wants you to picture this. When the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" So we're in one of those kind of slow passages. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Now, if we ended there, that would be an ending. But now we get this. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Such an interesting ending. No one could let that stay. So there are several more endings that have gotten tacked on to Mark over time. And when you read them, we're not looking at them tonight, but you can hear that the person who added them so late that you've got bits of Matthew, bits of Luke, and bits of John all thrown onto Mark because this is such a scary ending. There are a few really interesting things here. We've got our word amazement. If you're going to recognize the risen Lord, if you're going to recognize Jesus, not in his same earthly form that you've come to know, your mind's got to open in new ways. And all of the Gospels witness to people having to learn how to recognize him post-resurrection. And that amazement is just the beginning opening of their minds. But if any of you have ever worked with people who've been through severe trauma, sometimes they're speechless for quite a long time afterwards and cannot bring the thing that happened to words. And I think there's an understanding of that experience that lies behind this when it says, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In Greek, you can actually make it even worse. They didn't say nothing to nobody in Greek. They just pile on the negatives. And it ends actually this is kind of important for knowing like what Mark's doing here. It ends on that word for, as though the sentence might trail on. It's not completely undone in Greek, but it's highly unusual, especially to end an entire work with a conjunction. So it says they were afraid for. You can reverse the order of those. It means for they were afraid, but I just want you to understand how open-ended the ending is. Because I think what Mark wants you to do is write your own ending. He wants you to tell the story. You have to jump in there and finish this. And you also know, if you're receiving the story, you know somebody told, because otherwise you wouldn't have the story. I mean, the gospel is written in such a way that it knows all of that and still wants to provoke you to like stand up out of your seat and throw your own faith in. Maybe just a couple more things here. One is where it says another way that this gospel works, and the way that it ends with such an opening, is it's intended for you to actually go back to Galilee and start reading the gospel over again. It's circular. So when it's the second time that you go back through all of those Galilee stories earlier in Mark, that you start noticing all the resurrections. So it's the second time through that you notice that all of these people are rising in Galilee. And you start to kind of see, you also see the faith, like you see all these unnamed characters who have tremendous faith. And that, I think, is all the second time through when you start really encountering Jesus. And it trains you to see him in your own setting. Like, where do you see people rising? Where do you see people coming to faith? My last thing is, I didn't talk in the beginning about Mark in particular having probably a long oral history before it was written. And in the first century, when people, they're just not exposed to written documents the way we are. It's a completely oral culture for people at the standard of living that the earliest Christians were. There are very few of them who are literate. And so they knew their gospel by heart. And in my class, my Intro to the New Testament, I assign early in the semester, I assign passages from Mark to the students, or they choose their passage and they do some work on their passage. But at the end of the year, then we gather in a circle and each of us proclaims a piece of Mark by memory. And they have to use the NRSV, they have to do it from memory, they can't just wing it. And it's the most stunning thing. So I invite you to that if you sort of feel like that might be fun at some point. It might need to be after you can be in person again, because we did it online this last spring. It was fine, it was very powerful. But when you do it in person, we sit in a circle and then each person stands and just proclaims their piece. And it really gives you the sense of what it meant for those people to know their gospel by heart, and it becomes almost knit into their body. And so when a person proclaims the gospel themselves with their own voice, I can't tell you how much you start to see in your friends whom you know, you see the gospel taking hold. It's just really, really beautiful. All right, so that's everything I felt like I needed to say, but I would love to hear more things that you are thinking or that you want to ask. You can ask me general things about Mark or the New Testament.
I just found it really interesting when you shared with us about the history and the trauma that they had all been through before the writing. And I think so many of us in Bastrop County, we've been through 7 natural disasters. And I think right, our trauma, knowing family, friends that, yeah, if they look back, they would have lost their lives.
Yes,
Kind of can resonate with that.
absolutely.
I thought it was very interesting too that, you know, at the end of all these miracles, first of all, they're so inspiring, especially at this time to read these miracles. But Jesus asked them at the end of each miracle, do not tell anybody. Do not tell anybody.
Right.
Finally took this big, finally, they're amazed enough. Weren't the little ones enough amazing, those miracles, but it took this really big one for them not to talk.
No, they're stunned now into silence. Finally. What does it take to make you people be quiet?
Really?
I was struck by the fact that a lot of the really important people in these stories are women. The women and the faith that they represent, you know, in what I assume was a male-dominated society, hierarchical society, where women would not normally be considered the ones who are the shining examples of virtue, faith, or power. And to show someone in that position to represent the highest ideals is pretty impressive.
I agree. And I think that, you know, when I'm thinking, what are the kind of windows here into Jesus within his historical setting, I think he did raise women up. I mean, I think that is a hard datum that we encounter here in story after story after story. And for me, you know, I was around when the Episcopal Church was trying to decide whether or not to ordain women. And for me, the strongest argument was how Jesus raised up women clearly as leaders in a time when it was so much more countercultural than it is now, and seemed to expect women to be leaders. So yeah, I think it is really remarkable here.
Jane, I wonder if you could kind of expand on what's going on when Jesus says, please don't go tell anybody, as Kevin was mentioning.
Yeah, well, there are lots of guesses. So this is one of those things I'm always really careful to tell my students, okay, no one knows. Okay, so just get your mind around the fact no one knows. Okay, so now here are some guesses. So one of the guesses is that until you know about the whole story of the crucifixion and resurrection, you don't know how to tell that story. You don't really know what he's doing. You don't know what he's going to go through. You're going to talk about a miracle worker without understanding that he himself suffered and was raised by God. And, you know, the other interesting thing here, notice in the text, he has been raised. He is not here. It's really important in the New Testament. Jesus doesn't do his own rising. God raises him. He is dead and cannot do anything. Like, that's the power of God rushes in where there's death and brings life. And I just feel like sometimes in our setting, I hear people talk about Jesus as though he raised himself. But the whole poignancy of this story is he believed in the future of God enough without knowing what would happen to say, all I can see is this is going to end this entire ministry. Like, everything I was doing, it's over. But God, if this is the path you lead me on, I will go down this path, and I'll trust that somehow, I don't know, life will come, maybe not for me, maybe for someone. Like, what he only knew that he's following the God of life. He didn't know what would happen. And he has to be raised. And he's just like completely given it over to God at that point. So I think that's important. Okay, but another guess about, meanwhile, back to the question, why he tells people not to talk about it. Another guess is more of a kind of a social history kind of guess, that people afterwards were saying, well, how come if he did all these amazing things, how come the whole Jewish community didn't want to follow him? Like, why, how could they watch all that stuff and not be convinced? Well, he told people not to tell anybody. I kind of like the first answer myself, but yeah, there are lots of these things that really no one knows, but we try. I'm always saying to my students, there are lots of places like this where we can't know what the answer is. We try to, we're like detectives. We try to figure out what would be most likely. Because I've taught undergraduates too, and they love to say, but couldn't this happen and couldn't that happen? I'm like, yeah, anything can happen. But thinking historically, I think it's most likely that this or this happened.
I think he might have been thinking, you start telling people and it's just going to mess everything up. I'm on a path, I don't know where it's going to go, and I can't get ahead of whatever is happening. So you could really mess this up if you talk about it. You could really mess up what's happening because I might be taken away and not be able to do what I need to do. Just keep it to yourself. I'm doing this for you.
Yeah, just pay attention. And yes, thank you. You know, and I love, you just modeled, I think, exactly a really good way to read the gospel. Like, I think you really entered into it with all your heart and could see like that. I think you're right on. Like, that is a very possible guess, and really works inside this gospel, the sort of the way that Jesus is in this gospel. And I think all of the gospels have this quality to some extent, but Mark even more, like these little hooks to make you enter in and make that guess, because that you'll mess it up if you just start talking about this like you don't know yet what I'm really doing here. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so if you're not going to tell the story, you got to turn and look again. And I think that's what he's asking them to do. Thank you.
Welcome.
I have a question.
I'm interested in knowing why. In both my books, it says that
Sorry, I've lost your sound.
I have a question. I'm assuming, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm assuming that the disciples didn't know either why he was not to tell, people were not to tell.
Right. I don't think they know either. The disciples, you'll have fun with the disciples in Mark because they kind of bumble along. The disciples are stand-ins for us. They rarely get it. And I love them for that. I feel as though they're willing to look kind of foolish so I don't have to. So I don't have to ask the silly question. Yeah, they're really interesting. Matthew and Luke raise the disciples up so they don't look quite so silly. I think, Kim, you were going to ask something or say something.
Thank you. In this is 16:8 here. So they went out and fled from the tomb, and terror and amazement seized them. I'm curious what this, the Greek words for this, and I'm curious if these words are used. You know how you mentioned about people standing, and it meant to be raised, and then how that correlates with the resurrection. And I'm curious about these words, especially the word fled from the tomb. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what all this is, some of these Greek words. And
Great. Yeah, I mean, fled is, it is exactly the same as we have, like running really fast away from something that's scary. That's basically what that is. Let me see. Terror. Yeah, traumas. So the word for amazement is ekstasis, like ecstasy, standing outside yourself. So that's the word of amazement. That's why I say it's like knocks you, it knocks your head a little bit. And terror, it's trembling. So it's characteristic of Greek language, or the way emotions are conceived of. They come from the outside and they get you. So terror and amazement had seized them. So they understand that there's a you that's kind of separate from these strong emotions that come and take you over. It's a really interesting idea. So those things seized them and they couldn't say anything. It's really interesting. We've had that conversation about people being told not to say anything, and it's interesting to think of the good and bad sides of their not saying anything quite yet. They're supposed to go tell the disciples and Peter. They don't tell anybody right away. But
The fact that he specifically names Peter, because Peter, I'm sure, was in complete agony after denying and was feeling particularly bad, guilty, and he just picked his name out of all the others and said, "Be sure and tell Peter." Show some sort
I think
of
it's really
brotherhood.
One of the interesting things another interesting thing about kind of the origins of Mark is that an early story about the writer of Mark is that it was written down by Peter's secretary, basically, and that Mark was Peter's secretary. And I think it's really interesting if you think that these are some of the reminiscences of Peter contained in Mark. Peter doesn't come off well in the Gospel of Mark, really. He actually, this is not true in the other Gospels, but in Mark, he is kind of, when Jesus says, basically the name Peter, it means rocky. So when Jesus says, so now your name's Rocky, that he actually embodies the rocky ground from Mark 4, that receives the word with joy, but has trouble holding on to it. And I wonder if this is Peter's way of saying, I didn't get it. I felt terrible about that. I was right there the whole time and I didn't get it. That it really would deepen his character to me also, to think that he made sure all these stories were maintained, and he didn't make himself the hero of the story. He told it as it was.
Well, thank you, Jane. This is just such a wonderful gift.
It's so fun. Does it get any better than a group of people around the Bible? I don't think so. I hope it's been worthwhile for you all, and I wish you lots of good insights and good chance to be with each other around the Gospel of Mark as you go forward together.
Might you offer us a closing prayer and blessing as we continue our journey with Mark this Epiphany?
All right, I will do that. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we're so thankful for your word, for the ways in which it sometimes still comes to save us. We thank you for this time when your word has been not only what we've gathered around, but also a word spoken through each of us and among us. Pray that we may always recognize your word when we have a chance to hear it in our lives. I ask that you bless this group of travelers through Mark together as they go forward. May they have many times of finding themselves amazed that the risen Lord is in their midst. And the blessing of God Almighty be upon you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, this night and always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Jane. This was
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Have a good night, everybody.
Good
Good night.
night.